Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. I apologize. I hope everything is running okay. I had some technical difficulties, so I'm just getting everything back in place as we start. Let me know in the comments if everything sounds okay. But for now, I'm going to continue. Hang on, I can hear double now. Okay, are you hearing double right now? It all sounds okay? There's a slight delay. Okay. I'm just going to fix the audio for me, I think. That should be okay now. And I'm setting everything up. Yes, I'll see. If it sounds good and you can all hear it okay, then that's okay. Okay, so I will start off by saying that the views and opinions in this show are entirely my own and do not represent MSP Waves in any way. Okay, I'm just about ready here. I'm just going to get the chat up and running and we can start. As I hope some of you know, today is the first episode of the new format. I spoke a little bit of the last episode about the change and why I'm doing this, etc. And so here I can turn myself up as well, if that's better. And so due to, I'm just going to recap quickly, but due to the recent events of coronavirus, the global lockdown, etc. Thank you for the link. Yes, you can check out in chat. I decided to change from talking just about the eco-village and permaculture to talking about our history and the process that has led us to where we are today. I should say that I have been studying and expecting something like this for quite some time, and most people around me thought I was quite, well, let's say not normal in that sense, but this theory seems to be proving itself time and time again all over the world. And I feel that what I've learned and what I know could perhaps help some people out there to understand things a little bit better, to see a little bit more of a grand, bigger picture. And so it was with somewhat trepidation that I decided to talk about these subjects. So I should say right from the start that I've never actually spoken about these things in public. I've spoken with close friends and not all have been as understanding and welcoming as I would have hoped. And they're topics that are rather controversial and quite taboo, I think, in our society in general. Now, having said that, there is a larger community of people who are aware and quite knowledgeable about these subjects, and I think that quite a few of them may be in chat and certainly on Hive. So I don't feel alone, and during my travels I've met far more people than I would have imagined who were aware of these things. So it's a relatively small community, but I think it's growing. And as part of this community, I would like to become a voice as best I can with my knowledge and experience to share my views on these subjects. So I thought I would start the episode telling a little bit about how I came to learning about these things, researching and dedicating the better part of the last decade to really researching and studying these subjects. And I think I should probably start by clarifying what exactly I'm talking about. Now, as some of you may know, I'm rather a very big proponent of language and semantics and understanding the meaning of words and the subjective meaning or perception of words. And because of this, when thinking about how to term these theories, I had a little bit of different thoughts as to how to talk about it. But in my personal language and when I speak about these things, I do actually use the term conspiracy theories. Now, this is a demonized term. It's a term that was actually invented in order to push these things to outside of the normal realms. But I would like to reclaim this word. Yes, absolutely, well done for remembering. So I would like to reclaim this term, conspiracy theories, because the actual definition of a conspiracy theory, and I think I'll try and put it up in chat over here, might be quite different than what we'd think. Obviously, when we talk about conspiracy theories, we usually consider things that are quite ridiculous, things that are obviously untrue or very much not in line with the accepted norms. But it's actually quite specific, and it's, well, I don't know if specific is the word, it's sort of something that we see around us all the time. So the actual definition, I'm just going to very quickly read the beginning. This is from, I think, Webster. To join in a secret agreement to do an unlawful or wrongful act, or an act which becomes unlawful as a result of the secret agreement. So that's the definition of a conspiracy. And a theory is a conspiracy which has yet to be, say, proven, or as in the case of the theory of evolution, we might think of theories as being something that are clearly what we can see from the situation, even though we don't actually call them facts, because it's a theory, it's a thought that's presented. And so when I use the word conspiracy theory, that's all I'm talking about. I'm talking about secret agreements that are made away from the public that are wrong and harmful. Now, if we think about history, nearly all wrong and unlawful acts were done in secret because they were wrong and unlawful. And if people found out, they would probably object. So by definition, nearly all joint collaborative efforts for unlawful activity will be conspiracies. Fact. That's just language. So when people talk about conspiracy theories and do you believe conspiracy theories and what, it tends to delegitimize it by making it sound as if it's just a theory or a crackpot theory. But in actual fact, we are very much unaware of the many, many conspiracies that have been uncovered, that are no longer theories, but actual proven facts of history that have been uncovered. I mean, obviously in the last decade or two, I think we've seen more public uncoverings, but throughout history, there have been whistleblowers, and the term literally means someone inside an organization which is in secret doing this unlawful activity and feeling morally obligated to, usually at their own risk, reveal this information to the public. And I mean, just I think such a beacon of this kind of activity lately is Edward Snowden, who recently had a very interesting interview with Vice, if I'm not mistaken, about the COVID lockdown 19s. If anyone in chat could find the YouTube link, very interesting, very important, I think, discussion, because he is a very, very rational, thoughtful, as in thinks a lot, human being, Edward Snowden, and he uncovered a huge conspiracy by, at the very least, the NSA, a secret government organization which was acting against the law, and he revealed it at great risk. And obviously, I think most of us know the story. If you haven't, please look him up. Either of the films, 4chan or not 4, Citizen 4 or Edward Snowden, I think Snowden it's called, brilliant films, I think, in my humble opinion. So the term conspiracy theories is any kind of theory that there is a group, not just one, but a group of people who are meeting in secret in order to act in a wrongful way. That's it. So if that's the beginning of it, then how far can this theory actually take us? And I think it's important for me to start with my personal story. And when I first started to carefully climb down this rabbit hole, it was very unnerving. And I should say that as I was discovering these things and studying them, it was not a pleasant experience. It was a very frightening experience and a very depressing experience. It made me feel very, very hopeless. And I think that's in part why I carried on my intense research, trying to uncover as much as I could, because I felt that for most of this information, I felt I had nothing to do. I had no personal, individual way to deal with it or to affect it. If there is a secret government branch that's deciding certain things to harm humanity in some way, what can I possibly do besides possibly talk about it with people? But it did make me feel very, very hopeless and helpless in the beginning. I will say that once I've managed to wrap my head around it, and it's a lot of information from a lot of different branches. In my studies, it ranges from archaeology and all of the subjects of archaeoastronomy, and ranging to ancient history, to human evolution, to culture, to religion, spirituality, to occult and esoteric subjects. All of these are kind of intertwined, and it's very hard to grasp the large picture without having all of these different elements in place. And so because of that, it took me a long time to start to see a really more full appreciation of what was going on. However, the optimist that I am, once I'd reached this point where I sort of managed to see more or less and to understand it in its entirety, not obviously every detail, but to capture the larger picture from, let's say, 500,000 years ago to today, that was an understanding that gave me a lot of hope. And it was actually from that place and from that understanding that the idea of the eco-village came. So in a way, this is related still in my mind to what we should be doing. And if you learn nothing from anything else that I say, the eco-village idea is enough. You don't have to buy into any of these theories or alternative histories, in my mind, in order to do what's right and to fulfill yourself. But having said that, for me personally, the eco-village idea and the premise and the idea of how to, in effect, change the reality that we see rests on all of this information and conspiracy theories and occult and esoteric knowledge. So that was a little bit about my entrance into it. And the first conspiracy that I came across was probably the most famous, I think at that time, it was certainly what was coming, and it was the 9/11 conspiracy. For those who don't know, there is a tremendously large and legitimate movement, part of which, and a very important part in my mind, is a group of architects from Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. I think most of them are from Denmark, and some of them from around the world, who put together the studies in the documentary and more or less proved that the story, the mainstream story of an airplane crashing into a building and leveling it to the ground was physically inaccurate, in the sense that according to the laws, the known laws of physics that architects are very much aware of in terms of buildings and buildings collapsing, the story of an airplane or two crashing into a building and leveling it is just impossible. And if you've never heard of these things, it is a very, very interesting and possibly dangerous thread to pull. I would recommend to those who have never researched or have never seen it to look for, I can't remember the exact name, it's architects. If you research 9/11 architects, you're bound to find it. It's on YouTube. And it's all licensed, scientific people from the mainstream academia community. It's not, conspiracy theorists like myself who might be less of an impressive, let's say, resume to back up their facts. Oh, thank you, Patient Zero. Yeah, so there's a link in the chat for those who want. ae911truth.org. Is that the documentary? There's a lot of websites. Anyway, look into it in your own time. I'm not here to talk about that. But that was where I started. And for me, the understanding, as I delve deeper and deeper into the research of how you can prove and see beyond a shadow of a doubt that this the story that was being told was not the story, and the people who were telling it were aware very much that they were covering up for something else, and that this conspiracy runs very, very deep throughout the institution and the whole system and the infrastructure. And so it was, as I said, rather a difficult discovery for me, because it was very frightening. And for those who don't know, this is something that I talk about a lot. I have to say that when it comes to social experiments and I think like understandings, I do use the example of Nazis far too often. Probably because of my upbringing. I was brought up on the Second World War, and specifically the Holocaust tales from a very young age. It's something that's very, very, very present in the Israeli society. In fact, there was the Holocaust Remembrance Day this week. I can't remember exactly what day, but you have to excuse me if you feel that it's a little bit radical. But I do think that it is one of the best examples in history that we can see of a democratic Western country careening towards a fascist dictatorship with massive support. And this is exactly what I'm afraid of, because I live in a Western society, and I think most of my listeners are from Western societies. This is the kind of transformation that we should be aware of. And so the example that I would like to bring is there was a very famous night called Kristallnacht in German, if excuse my pronunciation, Glass Night. And it was the night that the German nationalists went out and destroyed and burned the Jewish houses, places of work, all of the Jewish-owned shops and stores in one fell swoop, in one night. This was decreed by Hitler before he was actually in power, I think, or fully in power. I'm not sure. But very early on, one of the first acts of sort of collective aggression against. And it was done in retaliation to the Reichstag being burnt down. And the Reichstag was an important government building, and obviously it was portrayed that the Jews had burnt down the Reichstag in an attempt, I think, against Germany in general, and that's what instigated this. And it turned out years later, obviously, that there was a conspiracy, and the conspiracy was that the Nazi government, it's okay to talk about the Nazis being conspirators because they were evil, but the Nazi government had decided to burn down the building, the Reichstag, themselves, in order to incite this hatred, and etc., etc. Now, this is unfortunately, a very common strategy. If you really look at it, what it means is that you are sacrificing something in order to gain something else. Now, obviously, when that sacrifice is done openly, it's very different. When it's done secretly and overtly covertly, but to influence the things that people think, the beliefs of people, then it's much more sinister, obviously. So, in my mind, and the way that I see it, the 9/11 incident was there in order to instigate what followed. And looking back nearly 20 years, I think next year is, 20 years, we can clearly see, whether it was organized, whether it was orchestrated or not, that sole act of terror, which is completely unparalleled since, which we've never seen anything like it, spiraled into our reality, a complete change in both the actual democratic laws and the state of the government and the power that the government had. This is all the surveillance and all of these different plans basically kept referring back to this incident in order to legitimize it. And worldwide, a state of fear, of terror, and fighting a conceptual war. No longer fighting an enemy, but fighting an idea. And this, when I saw in this light that the 9/11 attacks, which killed so many people, were instigated not even as an act of terror, but as an act to propel people towards a certain mind state, that was something that really frightened me. And it was at that moment that I said, okay, I need to see who did this, who these people are, what their objectives were or are, and really try and understand what's going on. So that was my start into this whole world of conspiracies. And from there, I mean, I moved forward into the monetary system and the World Bank and the IMF and the Federal Reserve. And I mean, there's a lot of very, very, shall we say, shady institutions, which if ever you would suspect an organization to conduct illegal, immoral, secret meetings and to conspire against citizens, it's very clear to see that those are going to be the main suspects. So, okay, before I continue much further, I just want to go through chat very quickly because I see that there's a lot going on and I'd like to be part of the discussion as well. No. Yes, the building number 7, which, yeah, it's such a crazy... I mean, honestly, as someone who's been following these things a long time, I think that the 9/11 was a very, very big mistake. I think that a lot of people who were on the fence or sort of not really aware before, that really pushed them to think that we should be questioning a lot more than we are and not just accepting mainstream media. And of course, COVID is, I think, another example of that being pushed forward even more. Okay, so in chat, I mean, everything that you're talking about, the 9/11, who did it, how, etc. I'm not going to get into any of that yet because it's actually a subject that I don't want to start from. And for me, and I think a lot of people that I meet who are interested in these things and have got interested in it over the past few years are very much focused on modern day era. Conspiracies ranging about 100 years ago, usually around 50 years ago, and no more than that. And so I think now it would be a good time for me to present a few of the people whom I sort of read and were a big influence on my studying in this subject. And the key thing is that all of these researchers talk about history. I'm not sure what we refer to as ancient history, but the earliest that some of these stories go back in terms of the importance of what happened is around 500,000 years. So 500,000 years ago. And we're going to get into that very soon, I hope. But in order to talk about these things, I'd like to mention a few names. And if you've never heard of these, well, I'm going to assume that none of you have ever heard of them. But if you'd like to research this a bit more, if you'd like to see a bit more information, there are many, many people out there, but these are the ones who influenced me the most. And so the first and foremost in my history was a man called Zacheria Sitchin. Now, Sitchin was a very, very interesting character. He was a professor, a doctor. I think he actually had a PhD in quite a few subjects. He studied archaeology and languages, and he was a very big part in the translation of a lot of the ancient languages, Sumerian, cuneiform, and Babylonian, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, all these different languages, and translating the works to to English from ancient Hebrew. He was actually Israeli. He was brought up in the US. I can't remember his exact life story, but he moved around a lot, and he actually studied in a regular school in Israel, and he studied the Bible, and that was the starting point for him. And for me personally, when I read the few books that he'd written about the subject, it was a very personal connection because I felt he came from the same place I did. He was studying the Orthodox Jewish texts from a very, very young age, and he was pointing out all of these things that were very, very curious. Now, as someone who was raised in Orthodox Judaism, whenever you come across something that sounds even, confusing, the answer can always come from, I think, what we term sort of a subtle underlying interpretation of the text, meaning it's not the straight text as it's read, but it's some kind of interpretation that one of these scholars has given. And as growing up in this system, that's a very, very common thing. You hear it all the time. There's always these two different ways of reading the text. One is the, on the surface, what's actually written, and the other is the underlying interpretation. And so Sitchin approached the text in the Bible from a purely written perspective, meaning no interpretation, no attempt to, see different meanings that could be underlying, etc., but actually take the plain text as is and study that as is. And he came across some very, very interesting facts. I won't go into all of his study because his books, although really fascinating, are written as scientific text, academic text studies. And so it's just fact after fact after fact. And it's not a very easy read. I enjoyed it. And I think it is telling a story, but as he goes through the story, he is giving a lot of scientific verification for the things he said, which is obviously understandable given the theory that he's proposing, but still it might be a bit of a dense read. And so I just want to give one small example, which is the name of God in the Jewish text. So in the Bible, when I'm talking about the Bible, I should specify, I'm talking about the Old Testament. And the reason Sitchin started doing all of this, or one of the reasons that he could, was that he was a native Hebrew speaker, and he spoke not only Hebrew, but he learned also the ancient languages that Hebrew came from. And a lot of his texts, a lot of what he studies, surprise, surprise, is about the translations and the origin of words, tracing them through different ancient languages and seeing the meaning of the words that way. So for me, obviously, that was another reason that I felt very much connected to him. And so one of the best examples is the name of God in the Jewish religion. And God in the Jewish religion has many, many names. It said, I think, 72 as a definite answer. But one of the names that he's given, or he, she, it, is gods with a plural S. And in Hebrew, it's quite unmistaken because it's the ending in Hebrew is two letters, Yud and Mem together. It makes a sound im, and so El would be the God. Eloha is another name for God, and then Elohim is the plural of Eloha, of one God. And so the name of the monotheistic singular God in the Jewish faith is a multiple of gods. And you might say, well, there's a lot of interpretations for that. But the sentences in the beginning of the Bible actually use the verbs in the plural sense. In Hebrew, you conjugate a verb to be plural or singular. And so you can clearly see that the verb is continuing this plural language. And so that's something that was it was instrumental in my understanding and my development, because I had been reading these texts from a very, very young age, or I should say I read these texts and then went on to read and then studied and then passed tests and have been living these texts. I can, obviously I'm not memorized the whole thing, but I have memorized quite a lot. And over the years, I've never thought about it being plural, never. And I must have read it. I mean, I don't know. But it's because of that. From a very young age, I was reading it. It became normal. People told me this is what it means. And I never questioned it. I never went back and was never able to read it with fresh eyes until this man who, was a rather random person for me to come across, was writing in this book saying, have you ever noticed, or why is it that the God is actually called gods and not the God, as he is referred to in every other place from then on? So the only place where he's mentioned with the verbs as plural is in Genesis. So it's very, very curious. I won't go into it right now as to what it means, why it is, etc. But that's just a little bit about who Sitchin was and what his background is. Now, Sitchin, when he describes these things, he is talking almost exclusively from an archaeological point of view, meaning he went around to these ancient digs and ancient sites and was uncovering artifacts to support his theory, and the literary translations, which is sort of complementary to what he was studying and uncovering. So that's one end of the spectrum, and he's obviously the most as academic as you can be talking about these theories, I think. On the other end of that spectrum is someone who is probably the least academic that you could be. And I think it's very important for me to start off this first show really laying my cards face up, because if these are subjects that don't interest you, if it's something that you feel in any way that it, I don't know, offends you or is just not worth your time, then this is the way it's going. So you should know from the start what the direction is. I will say that most of my studies I have supported in my mind with evidence and science, but not all. And I certainly believe there is a part of reality that the attempt to prove factually or an attempt to disregard experience that isn't would actually be a mistake. So that's my my theory. So the second person I'd like to mention is named Drunvelo Malchizedek. Now, Drunvelo Malchizedek is a very interesting character for those who may have heard of him. He's actually a lot more famous than he appears to be, because he's not known by his name. But if any of you have heard of spirit science, not to discredit spirit science in any way, but I was rather surprised when I'd seen most... Okay, so Spirit Science is a YouTube channel where they go through basic spiritual concepts rather in very good, very short videos for sort of basic understandings. A marvelous YouTube channel. Go check it out if you haven't heard of it. If you're interested in it, I do recommend. But I was a little bit upset when I learned that I think most of his early videos, the first 50 or so, were word for word quotes from Drunvelo Malchizedek's book. And, you know, I'm not going to go into any kind of plagiarism or anything like that. He does mention him by name, Drunvelo Malchizedek, a few times, and I wouldn't say that he's, you know, completely in disregard to it, but I was very much surprised when I saw that he was literally reading out a lot of sentences from the book. I was reading the book and I recognized the sentences because they were exact quotes. So if you've seen Spirit Science, if you know anything about it, if you enjoyed it, I would recommend go checking out Drunvelo Malchizedek's book. The book that I would recommend, and I actually found it online, is called The Secret to the Flower of Life, right? The Secret Teachings of the Flower of Life, sorry. And in that book, he covers it's sort of a two-part book. It's around 400 pages in total. He covers the whole spectrum. It's an amazing read. Now, when you say, okay, well, what are his credentials, etc.? In his terms and the way that he describes it, he has been receiving information through alternative channels for quite some time. He seems to be quite apt at it. And so it's very important for me to be upfront about the fact that if you're unable or unable to accept anything that isn't completely, you know, backed up by science, he might not be the best place for you to start. But for me, well, I should say that for me personally, I was reading his book while I was experiencing a lot of these things. And in fact, after I would experience, I would read his book, in his book, and read about the thing that I just experienced. So it was a very, very personal experience for me that was backed up by my reality. So I had a very powerful connection. It's very well written. I think it's very interesting and important information. And he doesn't talk as much about the archaeology and the language, although obviously he does a bit, but he talks a lot about sacred geometry, and the ideas and the concepts of sacred geometry have been used in humanity, I would say, far more in history than we see it in present day around us. So he talks a lot about the spiritual side of things. And although he speaks as well about a history of humanity, It's an alternative history to Drunvelo Malchizedek, which those two stories seem to be telling very different narratives. And that was rather confusing for me, to understand, to put it together. And I think it's very interesting that the next person I'd like to present, the researcher that I like, he was named Gerald Clarke, and he is the person who helped me to knit these two theories together and to see the dual-sided narrative that seems to be very disconnected, and yet if you can see the pieces and how they work together, they can be completely complementary. And in my mind, at least, I view these two theories as being equally not only valid, but actually occurring at the same time. So we'll get into that, I think, a little bit, but all of this is going to be a bit further down the road. I just want to give a brief overview of the people, and if you'd like to check out any of this, then some names for you to look into it. So Gerald Clarke is another very interesting character. He was a fighter pilot. I think he was actually he was a combat pilot, but I think he flew helicopters, and he was actually a medic. So he flew combat helicopters for the medics. Anyway, he was I should say, he's still publishing. He's an electrical engineer, and he studied a lot of these things, and he studied structural integration, or Rolfing for those who know, and he's a very, very interesting character. He's obviously gone through a lot of different subjects, but he eventually came across the monetary system and a lot of the medical system. His son actually has a rather rare genetic disorder, and I can't actually remember the name, but that started him also on this journey, both of understanding the human body and our brain's electromagnetic frequencies, and how our spine and all this fits together, both with structural integration, but also carrying on to a more spiritual application and understanding of, a lot of different things. He talks about how posture can affect mood, and how the chakra system is actually the list of ganglions of nerves that we have in our body, and really applying a lot of science and modern day science specifically to a lot of these very ancient, older theories that we have about the universe and about human beings. He obviously talks a lot about sacred geometry as well. And for me, his real, I think, gift, and what I took from him the most, was his ability to see and connect these different narratives. For example, one of the very, very important big researches that he conducted, was to trace the different gods in different cultures throughout history. And so the Sumerian gods, to the Babylonian gods, to the Egyptian gods, to the Greek gods, to the Roman gods, all of these different gods seem to be, or in my mind are, actual the same characters being passed on through cultures, changing both in names and language, but still maintaining this identity, which is a very interesting concept in and of itself, and I hope we'll get to that later. It's actually, I think, rather accepted to a certain degree. We see it with the Roman and Greek pantheon most easily, but that's because most people don't know about the Sumerian pantheon. So I'm hoping that we'll be talking about these things later on in future episodes, but that's a little bit of an overview of who Gerald Clarke is. Again, if you want to check him out, he has a YouTube channel. His books were also quite important in my development as well. And so the final character in my four-piece puzzle. Oh, you know what? Before I get into that, let me just check chat very quickly. Oh, wow. Is this the gods? Oh, I can't see in my chat. Rondon, I think, has just uploaded a picture. Yeah, yes. So let me see. First Hermes, Stellar Theology, Yahwehism, Enoch, Noah. Well done. So this is a list of the religions and the... but it's not deities, I think. This is yeah, the religions and the what is the term? Sorry, sort of the scholars or the important people. Wow, thanks for that, Rondon, for sharing that. So that'll be in chat for those of you who are seeing. Yes, yeah, I get. Then I had to open it. Hang on, let me just go. Yeah, so that's the attachment. So this is very interesting in seeing the different religions and the different connection. But this is a very, very comprehensive list, and it goes through the different continents as well. With a lot of these deities from the Sumerian pantheon, they seem to be geographically a lot closer. And I think there is a reason for that. And basically, I mean, it's a rather specific tale which involves, let's say, the Europe of today, which can be traced back to these, cultures that are around the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean. A little bit for those who don't know, that's the even according to the mainstream academia, that's the the cradle of our civilization, and obviously that's a very European perception of it, because it makes a lot of sense. It's in the center of the world map, so how couldn't it be? But definitely there is a narrative that I followed through, which is speaking of a specific group of deities to that area. However, as is the case in many things, there is the Asian counterpart, the South American counterpart, the Indo-Valley counterpart, etc. So there are these different groups, and we'll talk about some of them. I personally have focused much more on, as I was saying, the sort of Sumer until today European center, because that was, I think, just was what was more available. I would very much like to study more about Indian and Chinese mysticism. Unfortunately, the language is more of a barrier than most of these writings that are in English when it comes to European. So that's the reason, and I apologize for my lack in anything else. Oh my gosh, that's been going on so quickly. I'm going to try and catch up with that as we go. But I'm just going to carry on because I can see it's already 1:45. I can't believe it. We're halfway through. Okay, so this first episode is going to be a little bit about what's coming. I was hoping to get to human evolution, ancient civilizations, but we'll save that for next week, I think. So the final so let me just carry on with this. Yeah, the evolution of religion. Yeah. Wonderful. So the final person whom I'd like to talk about is actually very, very special. And of the four, he is the only one I have actually made contact with. And his name is Michael Tellinger. I'd be interested to know how many people have heard of him. He's sort of, I think, semi-famous. It depends. But I've actually mentioned Michael Tellinger before on the episode about money. And the reason being, he is, I think, one of the really leading activists against the current financial system, or at least he was. He's slightly declined in both activity and how fitting in funds, but that's really because he has put his life and soul and everything he has into this fight. So his story is a rather interesting one as well. As so many of the recognized conspiracy theorists, he actually started his life as an investigative journalist, and that led him down this sort of eventually. He's South African, I should mention. He is white and from South Africa, and he discovered the banking system, banksters as he likes to call them, and he decided, I think this was in 2011, 2010, I might be wrong, but around quite a long time ago. Yes, he is the gold guy, Michael, well done. He decided to sue the banking system in South Africa upon discovering both the corruption of the government and all that's going on. Now, I just want to say that in my mind, I was so surprised when I heard that, because that's a little bit like discovering the casino cheats and then trying to beat them at their own game. If you're trying to sue a government through that government's legal system, especially if you're investigating corruption, it just sounds like a little bit of a, I don't know, interesting idea. But that's my personal opinion. He went for it, and he really went through quite a few court cases trying to take it up. Obviously in the end it was thrown out of court, And that started him on this journey of realizing A, the system is corrupt, B, it cannot be just simply changed from the inside. These laws were meant to protect the people, and instead they're being used to oppress them. And he went on this whole journey of uncovering, and part of his studying was a lot of studying and researching the archaeological sites in South Africa. And he went on a long process. He's actually doing tours in South Africa of ancient sites right now. He's written a lot about it. He's found some very interesting things, and he deals a lot with ancient civilizations and ancient technologies that were being used. For example, one of the very interesting theories is there are gold mines in South Africa dating back, let me think, actually dating back 1 million years ago. 1 million years ago and 2 million years ago, and there's really no explanation besides the technologies that we didn't have. There was no smelting of gold or metals until much, much later, according to most of our scientific theories. And so, if you're interested, it's quite weird, but it's also rather specific. You have to understand about mining and radiation and the different ways of dating scientifically. But it is actually accepted that these mines exist and that they date back to very, very long ago. Well done, Rondon. Yes, we're going to get into all of that. But Michael Tellinger is, I think, one of the more unique people because I wouldn't say as myself, since he actually did it before. He went on after doing all of these things and researching and trying to get the words out. He actually started, well, the first thing was that he started a political party that was running in the South African government called the Ubuntu Party. I've mentioned Ubuntu in that episode, and that's the term that he uses to describe all of this new way of life. It's the name of his book, Ubuntu Contributionism. And he was running, I think it was like 2 terms that he was trying to run. So it was 4 years, and then like the 5th year he was running again. I think they went twice. They didn't get many votes at all, and they poured a lot of money into it, and obviously they have no funding. So it was, there's a lot of these stories where you see people who are really good and trying to do good, just not get anywhere when they try and do work with the system. It's very sad, and I've seen it happen too often. But that was what really took a big toll out of him, and he changed his activities, and he had to downscale and downsize a lot of the things that he was doing. But following that came a very interesting idea, which actually predates the eco-village, and I think obviously it's not the first time that someone conceived of this, but the idea was called One Small Town. And so instead of trying to form a government in South Africa or anywhere else, he decided to propose this plan for any mayor of a small town up to 1,000 residents. And this was an economic plan and a city planning strategy to make the town self-sustainable. And so the town would create its own power, would grow its own food, would collect its own water. The people would be required to work 3 hours a week. This whole plan is detailed if anyone is interested in reading it, because it's interesting. I can't say I agree with everything he proposes, but it's definitely a very interesting idea, and it did, I have to say that it did start me on my way and lend a lot of what I eventually came up with when we were thinking about the eco-village. And so it's still in action today, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, today he is running the One Small Town program in a few places. I'm not sure where exactly today. I think there's one place in Canada. Anyway, if you're interested, you can research it, you can check it out, but I'm not entirely sure right now. But that's where he is today, basically. So he's a very interesting person. He has, again, this very wide variety of going through a lot of archaeology, a lot of ancient technology, reading obviously the ancient texts, but also very much ingrained or trying to understand and work with the current system, the monetary system, the political system. And he's been through a lot of evolutions, as I've mentioned quite a few, in his path and in his attempt to sort of, well, basically deal with the situation and offer something a little bit better. Okay, so that's about the 4 researchers. I think we've got 10 minutes left, so I think we're going to stop because the next part is actually a big part. So let me just tell you a little bit, if you want to know, about what will be in the next episode. Let me know in the chat what you guys think about these subjects, if you've heard about them, if they're interesting. I'd like to know a little bit about the people in chat, sort of where you are in this whole thing, because it's a lot to get through. Oh, thanks for coming, Soundwaves Photon. And let me just check. Oh, okay. I see chat wasn't anything too important that I missed. Okay. So next week I will be starting the story, and as far as I'm concerned, it's very, very important to look back and to go, well, as far back as necessary in order to start grasping this real path that we as humans have been walking down for quite some time. And so I would like to start with the theory of evolution, of all things, and talk a little bit about, I would say that I obviously agree with the theory of evolution. I think that it exists. It's quite easy to see that the universe works in this progressive, chronological, incremental, development, whether it's things that are growing or advancing, processing, etc. So it makes a lot of sense to see that that is the same throughout the universe. But however, I think there is more that can be said than just this main narrative that we have. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and about the first humans and what was actually going on from the beginning. And that will lead us up nicely into ancient civilizations. And so I will just say, that when it comes to ancient civilizations, there was a lot, in my mind, going on antediluvian, before the Great Flood. For those who don't know, or in any way, there was a big flood at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, and it wiped out most of the face of the planet, and Sumer was the first civilization to rise after that flood. Now, that, as far as I'm concerned, that was all scientifically accepted theory today. But the question is, what was around here before that flood? And when we look at the Sumerian texts, we see them talking a lot about the cultures that led up to and those that actually instigated the Sumerian culture. And so as far as I'm concerned, going back 6,000 to 8,000 years to 6,000 years ago to the Sumerian culture and that beginning is far enough, in my mind, to sort of grasp what's going on. But it is important to say that long before the Sumerian culture was around, there were other civilizations that they speak of, and these civilizations seem to be also precursors to what came afterwards and an important part in this plot. So I would say that I'm going to be focusing a lot on the Sumerian culture. They are the ones who are our sort of gateway to the antediluvian world, to the world before the flood. But at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that there were these cultures that came before, and the importance of how that changes our narrative. So the two cultures that are sort of sister cultures in that regard are Sumer and Egypt, as being very distinct cultures and affecting their surrounding nations, very much so, and indeed affecting a lot of history. So I will see. Well, to be honest, I thought I'd get through a lot more this week, so I'll have to see how it goes next week if we'll have time for more. Yeah, if you want, if any of you are on Hive or anywhere in the chat, if you've got any subjects that you have heard about or that you'd like me to talk about, please feel free, because there's a lot of information. There's a lot to go over. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm trying to construct a narrative that sort of will be explaining it chronologically as things develop, but at the same time, there are lots and lots of different branches. And as you may have noticed, I sometimes tend to wander off. I do enjoy it. I think it's good to see a very lateral and interconnected view as well. And so if you guys can point me in any direction, then that would be great. Okay, great. So I can see the people in chat are rather aware of the things I'm talking about. I have to say I was expecting to a certain degree, and I'm a little more apprehensive of my offline listeners, who I think may be a little more new to these subjects. But it's always wonderful to have my listeners to feel that we're on the same wavelength. So thank you very much for your support and for your continued support, even through this change in format. It's very much appreciated. Revised Sociology, thank you so much for joining. Sorry, all the people in chat, Crimson Clad and Hivesteam, Patient Zero, Lax, Rondon, I can never forget, how do you pronounce your name? I'm sorry, I always forget. But thank you all for joining me. I was a little bit on edge in the beginning because I restarted my computer when I shouldn't have, and I literally was streaming, I think, 10 seconds before I was live, something like that. So relative to that, I'm pleased, but it means that I was a little bit not quite with it in the beginning. Let's see in the chat, what else have we got here? This, sorry, just one moment. Sorry, I still have a little bit of a... Talking for an hour straight is a bit hard on your throat. Creationism and evolution theory don't have to be mutually exclusive. Well done. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, we'll get into more of that. Creationism is also one of those trigger words, because I've seen a lot of creationists who are very unscientific in their approach. And that can give a bad name, just like I've met a lot of conspiracy theorists who don't approach the subject with the same scientific vigor that I personally would like to see. Okay, so if a data got it like 1,000 years and Earth was created in 7 days, that's about 7,000 years of creation, would look a lot like evolution. Absolutely. Oh, okay. But we're not going to get into the discussion of the evolution of material, because I'm going to be focusing entirely on the evolution of human beings. Whether the theory of evolution, the dinosaurs, or anything else, in my mind, is less important, as is the fact that humanity seems to so clearly stand out and be very, very different from everything else. Okay, so that will be it from me. Thank you ever so much for listening. I hope you join next week for our continued discussion, and hope you have a good week going. Enjoy.